Hi, I'm Transapient. It may surprise some to realize just how variable Kaiju Eiga can be. Kaiju stories can span a wide range of demographics and genres, from kid-friendly sci-fi and fantasy adventures to horror-themed social satires. And Kaiju themselves can also represent or symbolize many things, from man-made mistakes to higher powers. All that being said, one genre that most, even hardcore kaiju fans, would not typically associate with giant monsters is romance. Even on occasions where some kaiju have been depicted as mated pairs, the dynamics of the relationship are not really the main focus of the story. Same goes for the human aspects as well. They might have partners or love interests, but again, it's not really the central theme of the story. Indeed, one would be hard-pressed to find a romantically focused kaiju story, if one even bothers to look for such a thing at all. But recently, I have indeed stumbled across an example which I believe deserves a closer inspection. Allow me to introduce Kaiju Girl Caramelise, a shoujo manga series that puts a rather unconventional spin on young love, possibly in more ways than the obvious inclusion of a giant monster. Assuming you've read the title of this video, you may already have some ideas or questions as to what I mean. But stick with me and I'll try to explain as best I can. Kaiju Girl Caramelise tells the story of Kuro, a high schooler afflicted with a strange condition that warps and changes parts of her body into monstrous forms whenever she experiences powerful emotions. In keeping this condition a secret for years, she's become gloomy and antisocial, convinced that nobody would accept her for the way she is. Things change though as she starts getting to know Arata Minami, a handsome boy who seems genuinely interested in becoming her friend. Soon her feelings escalate to the boiling point, and for the first time she transforms fully into a giant monster the media dubs Harugan. And so, Kuro must decide whether or not to accept and pursue her desire for a relationship despite the emotional, not to mention physical, hazards to herself and those around her. Now, currently I've only managed to collect and read the first 2 volumes, so I can't quite speak of the quality of the story as a whole. So far though, I can honestly say that I've been enjoying myself. There are some elements that start out feeling a bit cliché for this type of story, but the twist of Kuro's condition adds a new dynamic that keeps things interesting and fun to follow. The author is also clearly a kaiju fan themselves, and so there are a number of references and inside jokes that I'm sure other fans can appreciate. Overall, I'm intrigued to see how things turn out, which is a positive trait for any story. However, my opinion on the story's quality isn't really what this video's about. Rather, there are elements as to the portrayal of Kuro's character that gave me certain impressions. And after a bit of research and thinking on it, I believe they add up to a theme that warrants a deeper look. As per the title of the video, I think Kaiju Girl Caramelise may be seen as a metaphor for autism. More specifically, autism in females. Now, autism may have a few defining traits, but many specifics can vary on a case-by-case basis, such as the level of social or communication impairment and repetitive behaviors. So please keep in mind going forward that I can only speak of this in broad terms. Also, please note that I am not an expert in this field myself, but have researched as best I could, and will provide links to some of the sources I used in the description. On the same page now? Good. Now then, the reason I specified autism in females is that women and girls with ASD generally differ from men and boys in a few key ways which have made them far less conspicuous as a demographic. There are a few hypotheses as to why and or how this may be. One being that there may be something of a bias in how autism is generally assessed and diagnosed, as many of its foundational studies were based on groups that were predominantly male. Even today, autism is seen as affecting more males than females, with some estimates placing the ratio at about 4-to-1. However, as previously mentioned, it's starting to become more widely accepted that autism also tends to be expressed differently in females. One key difference is that whereas boys on the spectrum don't usually seem to mind a lack of extensive friendships, girls on the spectrum are usually as socially motivated as other girls, and are generally better at interpreting facial expressions. And so, girls on the subtler end of the spectrum often learn to better mimic the behaviors of those around them in order to fit in, even if they may not fully understand all of the social nuances of what they're doing. Also, whereas both males and females on the spectrum often develop very specific interests, girls on the spectrum generally tend to develop similar types of interests as so-called neurotypical girls, with the key difference for them being the intensity of such interests. Autistic girls also don't usually display as much repetitive behaviors as boys, at least on a surface level. All this is to say that females on the ASD spectrum tend to be more overlooked or diagnosed much later in life as compared to males. Now then, what's all this got to do with Kaiju Girl Caramelise? Well, I believe the main protagonist, Kuro, and by extension her kaiju alter ego Harugan, may be interpreted as a representation of this often overlooked demographic, and some of their common struggles. But hold up, all this is assuming Kuro is even on the spectrum. So, is she? Well, that's a bit complicated to answer. Assuming also that you've been paying attention to my ramblings, you've probably noticed I keep using phrases such as maybe, I believe, or possibly. Well, that's because it's not guaranteed my interpretation of this series was specifically intended by the artist, Spika Aoki. Probably not pronouncing that right. However, as a work of art, I believe the subject is still open to multiple interpretations so long as it lines up with the facts presented within said subject. So, firstly, allow me to explain why I think Kuro can be interpreted as an autistic character. Again though, please keep in mind that autism can vary greatly on an individual basis, and that I can only make inferences based on general traits. If nothing else, Kuro is certainly a conflicted girl, who spent nearly her whole life struggling to conceal her condition. At the time of her introduction in the manga, this has developed into a negative self-image that prompts her to avoid unnecessary contact, socially or physically, with her peers. Though this changes gradually between her and Arata as they become closer, she continues to have difficulties with expressing her true thoughts or feelings, which lead to many misunderstandings, some of which may be humorous, others emotionally devastating for her. Eye contact also seems to be an especially intense experience for her, as it is with many people on the ASD spectrum. Despite her attempts to retain a composed and humanoid exterior, she's actually quite emotional. And since it's at these times she's apt to break out and reveal her condition, she does as much as she can to remain calm. This usually involves retreating to a private space where she can be alone and engage in self-soothing thoughts. Such self-regulatory stimulation is another very common behavior associated with autism, and can be expressed physically or mentally, as seems to be the case for Kuro. Many people on the spectrum also tend to prefer living by highly ordered schedules or plans of expected behavior, and disruptions to this schedule can often be distressing. Kuro, too, often attempts to make detailed plans and can quickly become overwhelmed whenever events spiral out of control. Again, another common trait of ASD is specific interests. Stereotypical depictions of this trait often focus on mechanical or mathematical subjects, but there are many people who develop interests in the arts. Indeed, Kuro displays a gifted artistic talent, expressed as unique, thematically consistent visions within her work. She also seems particularly interested in specific foods and musical genres. Unfortunately, as is the case with many nonconformities, Kuro is shown to be bullied and ostracized by the more insensitive of her peers. This only contributes to her self-destructive bouts of depression, self-doubt, and fear of rejection. This treatment is exacerbated by her often awkward attempts at communication, and other girls often refer to her as psychotan. The original Japanese text translates as menheratan, which is basically a slang term for someone with mental health issues, and in context is meant to be an insult. Altogether, Kuro's social and communication difficulties, reliance on self-regulatory behaviors and plans of action, and singular interests are what led me to interpret her as an autistic character. Alright then, so hopefully you can now see why I think Kuro can be on the spectrum. But now comes the ultimate question. How does Kaiju Girl Caramelise utilize this within the story? After all, this whole idea of the series being a metaphor for female autism wouldn't really work out if it wasn't a driving point of the story. Well, if I had to sum it up in a word, obviousness. Kaiju Girl Caramelise makes obvious what is normally obscured. As a reminder, it's becoming more widely accepted that autism is often expressed differently in females as compared to males, and usually in such a way as to make it far more difficult to pinpoint and diagnose young girls and women on the subtler end of the spectrum. Females will often work harder to conceal their social difficulties or struggles, and as a result, autistic girls and women often receive little acknowledgement. And so, when such individuals openly discuss their condition, other people may be taken by surprise since they don't usually, quote, look or act autistic. For Kuro Akaishi, though, this under-the-radar approach is not an option. Case in point, here's an image of Kuro visiting a totally not copyright infringement amusement park. I know it's a big crowd, but she's way back there in the background. See her? Not the most discreet patron, is she? Many of the primary conflicts within the manga arise when she loses control of her emotions and her facade breaks down. In spite of all her efforts to appear as a normal girl, Kuro can't escape the other part of who she is. Her transformations are essentially an overt representation of the inner turmoil that can build within someone with ASD, to the point of an emotional outburst or meltdown. And naturally, she fears the truth of her condition being uncovered by those she wants to be closer to. How could they accept her if they could see what she's really like? Indeed, her form isn't exactly what society at large would deem socially acceptable. This is what I find to be the most compelling theme, so far, of Kaiju Girl Caramelise. By portraying autistic symptoms as an obvious physical manifestation rather than a purely psychological one, it forces the characters to acknowledge and deal with its ramifications. There's no hiding or getting around a kaiju, after all. And this goes both ways. Not only must Kuro attempt better self-control, but other characters must attempt better understanding. And through it all, there is hope. For although it may be harder for her, finding acceptance and even love is not outside her grasp. Nor is it for girls and all other people with ASD in real life either. But that's all just this one Transapien's opinion. Now then, what do you think? If you or someone you know is on the spectrum, or on the greater off chance that you've also heard of and or read Kaiju Girl Caramelise, I'd be interested to know in the comments section if you agree or disagree with my assessment and why. Thank you very much for watching, and have a nice day.